Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading Chapter 11 of Pawn of Prophecy. Chapter 11. They were 9 days on the coast road from Kamar to the capital at Sendar. Though it was only 55 leagues, Captain Brendig measured their pace carefully, and his detachment of soldiers was arranged in such fashion that even the thought of escape was impossible. Although it had stopped snowing, the road was still difficult, and the wind which blew it in off the sea and across the broad snow-covered salt marshes was raw and chill. They stayed each night in the evenly spaced Sendarian hostels, which stood like mileposts along the uninhabited stretch of coast. The hostels were not quite so well appointed as were their Talnedran counterparts along the Great North Road, but they were at least adequate. Captain Brendig seemed solicitous about their comfort, but he also posted guards each night. On the evening of the second day, Garion sat near the fire with Dernick, staring moodily into the flames. Dernick was his oldest friend, and Garion felt a desperate need for friendship just then. "Dernick," he said finally. "Yes, lad." "Have you ever been in a dungeon?" "What could I have done to be put into a dungeon?" "I thought you might have seen one sometime." "Honest folk don't go near such places," Dernick said. "I've heard they're awful, dark and cold, full of rats." "What's all this talk of dungeons?" Dernick asked. "I'm afraid we may find out all about places like that very soon," Garion said, trying not to sound too frightened. "We've done nothing wrong," Dernick said. "Then why would the king have us seized like this? Kings don't do things like that without good reason." "We haven't done anything wrong," Dernick repeated stubbornly. "Well, maybe Mr. Wolf has," Garion suggested. "The king wouldn't send all these soldiers after him without some reason, and we could all be thrown in the dungeon with him just because we happen to be his companions." "Things like that don't happen in Sendaria," Dernick said firmly. The next day the wind was very strong as it blew in off the sea, but it was a warm wind, and the foot-deep snow on the road began to turn slushy. By midday it had started to rain. They rode in sodden misery toward the next hostel. "I'm afraid we'll have to delay our journey until this blows out," Captain Brendig said that evening, looking out of the tiny windows of the hostel. "The road's going to be quite impassable by morning." They spent all the next day and the next sitting in the cramped main room of the hostel, listening to the wind-driven rain slashing at the walls and roof, all the while under the watchful eyes of Brendig and his soldiers. "Silk," Garion said on the second day, moving over to the bench where the rat-faced little man sat dozing. "Yes, Garion," Silk asked, rousing himself. "What kind of man is the king?" "Which king?" "Of Sendaria." "A foolish man, like all kings," Silk laughed. "The Sendarian kings are perhaps a bit more foolish, but that's only natural. Why do you ask?" "Well," Garion hesitated, "let's suppose that somebody did something that the king didn't like, and there were some other people who traveled with him, and the king had people seized. Would the king just throw all them into the dungeon, or would he let the others go and just keep the one who angered him?" Silk looked at him for a moment, and then spoke firmly. "The question's unworthy of you, Garion." Garion flushed. "I'm afraid of dungeons," he said in a small voice, suddenly very ashamed of himself. "I don't want to be locked up in the dark forever when I don't even know what for." "The kings of Sendaria are just and honest men," Silk told him. "Not too bright, I'm afraid, but always fair." "How can they be kings if they aren't wise?" Garion objected. "Wisdom's a useful trait in a king," Silk said, "but hardly essential." "How do they get to be kings, then?" Garion demanded. "Some are born to it," Silk said. "The stupidest man in the world can be a king if he has the right parents. Sendarian kings have a disadvantage because they started so low." "Low?" "They were elected. Nobody ever elected a king before, only the Sendars." "How do you elect a king?" Silk smiled. "Very badly, Garion. It's a poor way to select a king. The other ways are worse, but election is a very bad way to choose a king." "Tell me how it was done," Garion said. Silk glanced briefly at the rain-spattered window across the room and shrugged. "It's a way to pass the time," he said, and then he leaned back. stretched his feet toward the fire and began. It all started about 1,500 years ago, he said, his voice loud enough to reach the ears of Captain Brendig, who sat nearby writing on a piece of parchment. Sendaria wasn't a kingdom then, not even a separate country. It had belonged from time to time to Cherek, Algaria, or the northern Arens, Wassite, or Asturian, depending on the fortunes of the Arendish Civil War. When the war finally came to an end and the Wassites were destroyed and the Asturians had been defeated and driven into the untracked reaches of the Great Forest in northern Arendia, the Emperor of Talnidra, Ramhorb II, decided there ought to be a kingdom here. How could a Talnidran emperor make that kind of decision for Sendaria? Garion asked. The arm of the empire is very long, Silk said. The Great North Road had been built during the Second Baroon dynasty. I think it was Ranbaroon IV who started the construction, wasn't it, Captain? The fifth, Brendig said somewhat sourly, without looking up. Ranbaroon V. Thank you, Captain, Silk said. I can never keep the Baroon dynasty straight. Anyway, they were already imperial legions in Sendaria to maintain the highway, and if one had troops in an area, one had a certain authority, wouldn't you say, Captain? It's your story, Brendig said shortly. Indeed it is, Silk agreed. Now it wasn't really out of any kind of generosity that Ranhor made his decision, Garion. Don't misunderstand that. Talnidrans never give anything away. It was just that Membrate Arens had finally won the Arendish Civil War of 1,000 years of bloodshed and treachery, and Talnidran couldn't afford to allow the Membrates to expand into the north. The creation of an independent kingdom in Sendaria would block Membrate access to the trade routes down out of Drasnia and prevent the seat of world power from moving to Vomember and leaving the imperial capital at Talhanath in a kind of backwater. It all sounds terribly involved, Garion said. Not really, Silk said. It's only politics. That's a very simple game, isn't it, Captain? A game I do not play, Brendig said, not looking up. Really? Silk asked. So long at court and not a politician? You're a rare man, Captain. At any rate, the Sundars suddenly discovered that they had themselves a kingdom, but they had no genuine hereditary nobility. Oh, there were a few retired Talnidran nobles living on estates here and there, assorted pretenders to this or that Wassite or Asturian title, a Cherek war chief or two with a few followers, but no genuine Sendarian nobility, and so it was that they decided to hold a national election, select a king, don't you see, and then leave the bestowing of titles up to him. A very practical approach, and typically in Sendarian. How do you elect a king? Garion asked, beginning to lose his dread of dungeons and his fascination with the story. Everybody votes, Silk said simply. Parents, of course, probably cast the votes for their children, but it appears that there was very little cheating. The rest of the world stood around and laughed at all this foolishness, but the Sendars continued to cast ballot after ballot for a dozen years. 6 years, actually, Brendig said, with his face still down over his parchment. 3827 to 3833. There were over 1,000 candidates, Silk said expansively. 743, Brendig said tightly. I stand corrected, noble captain, Silk said. It is an enormous comfort to have such an expert here to catch my errors. I am but a simple Drasnian merchant with little background in history. Anyway, on the 23rd ballot, they finally elected their king, a rutabaga farmer named Fandor. He raised more than just rutabagas, Brendig said, looking up with an angry face. Of course he did, Silk said, smacking his forehead with an open palm. How could I have forgotten the cabbages? He raised cabbages too, Garion. Never forget the cabbages. Well, everybody in Sendaria who thought he was important journeyed to Fundor's farm and found him vigorously fertilizing his fields, and they greeted him with a great cry, Hail, Fundor, the magnificent king of Sendaria, and fell on their knees in this august presence. Must we continue with this? Brendig asked in a pained voice, looking up. The boy wants to know, Captain, Silk replied with an innocent face. It's our duty as his elders to instruct him in the history of our past, wouldn't you say? Say whatever you like, Brendig said in a stiff voice. Thank you for your permission, Captain, Silk said, inclining his head. Do you know what the king of Sendaria said then, Garion? He asked. No, Garion said. What? I pray you, eminences, the king said, have a care for your finery. I have just well manured the bed in which you are kneeling. Beric, who was sitting nearby, roared with laughter, pounding his knee with one huge hand. I find this less than amusing, sir, Captain Brendig said, coldly rising to his feet. I make no jokes about the king of Drasnia, do I? You're a courteous man, Captain, Silk said mildly, and a nobleman. I'm merely a poor man trying to make his way in the world. Brendig looked at him helplessly, and then turned and stamped from the room. The following morning, the wind had blown itself out, and the rain had stopped. The road was very nearly a quagmire, but Brendig decided that they must continue. Travel that day was difficult, but the next was somewhat easier as the road began to drain. Aunt Paul seemed unconcerned by the fact that they had been seized at the king's orders. She maintained her regal bearing, even though Garion saw no need to continue the subterfuge and wished fervently that she would abandon it. The familiar practical sensibility with which she had ruled her kitchen at Falder's farm had somehow been replaced by a kind of demanding willfulness that Garion found particularly distressing. For the first time in his life, he felt a distance between them, and it left a vacancy that had never been there before. To make matters worse, the gnawing uncertainty which had been steadily growing since Silk's unequivocal declaration on the hilltop outside Winnold that Aunt Paul could not possibly be his aunt, sawed roughly at his sense of his own identity, and Garion often found himself staring at an awful question. Who am I? Mr. Wolf seemed changed as well. He seldom spoke, either on the road nor at night in the hostels. He spent a great deal of time sitting by himself with an expression of moody irritability on his face. Finally, on the 9th day of their departure from Kamar, the broad salt marshes ended, and the land along the coast became more rolling. They topped a hill about midday, just as the pale winter sun broke through the clouds, and there in the valley below them the walled city of Sandar lay facing the sea. The detachment of guards at the south gate of the city saluted smartly at Captain Brendig, led the little party through, and he returned their salute crisply. The broad streets of the cities seemed filled with people in the finest clothing, all moving about importantly, as if their errands were the most vital in the world. Courtiers, Berg, who chanced to be riding beside Garion, snorted with contempt. Not a real man amongst them. A necessary evil, my dear Beric, Silk said back over his shoulder to the big man. Little jobs require little men. It's the little jobs that keep a kingdom running. After they had passed through a magnificently large square, they moved up a wide avenue to the palace. It was a very large building with many stories and broad wings extending out on each of the paved courtyards. The entire structure was surmounted by a round tower that was easily the highest edifice in the whole city. Where do you suppose the dungeons are? Garion whispered to Dernick when they stopped. I would take it most kindly, Garion, Dernick said with a pained look, if you would not speak so much of dungeons. Captain Brendig dismounted and went to meet a fussy-looking man in an embroidered tunic and feathered cap, who came down the wide strips at the front of the palace to meet them. They spoke for a few moments and seemed to be arguing. My orders are from the king himself, Brendig said, his voice carrying to where they sat. I am commanded to deliver these people directly to him immediately upon our arrival. My orders are also from the king, the fussy-looking man said, and I am commanded to have them made presentable before they are delivered to the throne room. I'll take charge of them. They'll remain in my custody, Count Nilden, until they have been delivered to the king himself, Brendig said coldly. I won't have your muddy soldiers trekking through the halls of the palace, Lord Brendig, the count replied. Then we'll wait here, Count Nilden, Brendig said. Be so good as to fetch his majesty. Fetch? The Count's face was aghast. I am chief butler to his majesty's household, Lord Brendig. I do not fetch anything or anybody. Brendig turned as if to remount his horse. Oh, very well, Count Nilden said petulantly. If you must have it your own way, at least have them wipe their feet. Brendig bowed coldly. I won't forget this, Lord Brendig, Nilden threatened. Nor shall I, Count Nilden, Brendig replied. Then they all dismounted, with Brendig's soldiers drawn up in close order about them. They crossed the courtyard to a broad door near the center of the west wing. Be so good as to follow me, Count Nilden said, glancing with a shudder at the mud-splattered soldiers, and led them into a wide corridor which lay beyond the door. Apprehension and curiosity struggled in Garion's mind. Despite the assurances of Silk and Dernick, and the hopeful implications of Count Nilden's announcement that he was going to have them made presentable, the threat of some clammy rat-infested dungeon, complete with a rack and a wheel of other unpleasant things, still seemed very real. On the other hand, he had never been in a palace before, and his eyes tried to be everywhere at once. That part of his mind which sometimes spoke to him in dry detachment told him that his fears were probably groundless, that his gawking made him appear to be a doltish country bumpkin. Count Nilden led them directly to a part of the corridor where there were a number of highly polished doors. This one is for the boy, he announced, pointing at one of them. One of the soldiers opened the door, and Garion reluctantly stepped through, looking back over his shoulder at Aunt Paul. Come along now, a somewhat impatient voice said. Garion whirled, not knowing what to expect. Close the door, boy, the fine-looking man been waiting for him said. We don't have all day, you know. The man was waiting beside a wooden tub with steam rising from it. Quickly, boy, take off those filthy rags and get into the tub. His Majesty is waiting. Too confused to object or even answer, Garion numbly began to unlace his tunic. After he had been bathed and the knots had been brushed out of his hair, he was dressed in clothes which lay on a nearby bench. His coarse woolen hose of a serviceable peasant brown were exchanged for ones of much finer weave and a lustrous blue. His scuffed and muddy boots were traded for soft leather shoes. His tunic was soft white linen, and the doublet he wore over it was a rich blue, trimmed with a silvery fur. I guess that's the best I can do on short notice, the man who had bathed and dressed him said, looking him up and down critically. At least I won't be totally embarrassed when you're presented to the king. Garion mumbled his thanks and stood waiting for further instructions. Well, go along, boy. You mustn't keep his majesty waiting. Silk and Barrack stood in the corridor, talking quietly. Barrack was hugely splendid in a green brocade doublet, but looked uncomfortable without his sword. Silk's doublet was a rich black trimmed in silver, and his scraggly whiskers had been carefully trimmed into an elegant short beard. What does all this mean? Garion asked as he joined them. We're to be presented to the king, Barrack said, and our honest clothes might have given offense. Kings aren't accustomed to looking at ordinary men. Dernick emerged from one of the rooms, his face pale with anger. That overdressed fool wanted to give me a bath, he said in choked outrage. It's the custom, Silk explained. Noble guests aren't expected to bathe themselves. I hope you didn't hurt him. I'm not a noble, and I'm quite able to bathe myself, Dernick said hotly. I told him that I'd drown him in his own tub if he didn't keep his hands to himself. After that, he didn't pester me anymore, but he did steal my clothes. I had to put these on instead. He gestured at his clothes, which were quite similar to Garion's. I hope nobody sees me in all his frippery. Barrack says the king might be offended if he saw us in our real clothes, Garion told him. The king won't be looking at me, Dernick said, and I don't like this business of trying to look like something I'm not. I'll wait outside with the horses if I can get my own clothes back. Be patient, Dernick, Barrack advised. We'll get this business with the king straightened out and then be on our way again. If Dernick was angry, Mr. Wolf was in what could best be described as a towering fury. He came out into the corridor dressed in a snowy white robe, deeply cowled at the back. "Someone's going to pay for this," he raged. "It does become you," Silk said admiringly. "Your taste has always been questionable, Master Silk," Wolf said in a frosty tone. "Where's Paul?" "The lady has not made her appearance," Silk said. "I should have known," Wolf said, sitting down on a nearby bench. "We may as well be comfortable. Paul's preparations usually take quite a while." And so they waited. Captain Brendig, who had changed his boots and doublet, paced up and down as the minutes dragged by. Garion was totally baffled by their reception. They did not seem to be under arrest, but his imagination still had dungeons, and that was enough to make him very jumpy. And then Aunt Paul appeared. She wore the blue velvet gown that had been made for her in Kamar, and a silver circlet had about her head which set off the single white lock at her brow. Her bearing was regal and her face stern. "So soon, Mistress Paul?" Wolf asked dryly. "I hope you weren't rushed." She ignored that and examined each of them in turn. "Adequate, I suppose," she said finally, absently adjusting the collar of Garion's doublet. "Give me your arm, old Wolf, and let's find out what the King of the Sendars wants with us." Mr. Wolf rose from his bench, extended his arm, and the two of them started down the corridor. Captain Brendig hastily assembled his soldiers and followed them all in some kind of ragged order. "If you please, my lady," he called out to Aunt Paul, "permit me to show you the way." "We know the way, Lord Brendig," she replied, without so much as turning her head. Count Nilden, the chief butler, stood waiting for them in front of two massive doors guarded by uniformed men-at-arms. He bowed slightly to Aunt Paul and snapped his fingers. The men-at-arms swung the heavy doors inward. Fulrach, the King of Sendars, was a dumpy-looking man with a short brown beard. He sat rather uncomfortably, it appeared, on a high-backed throne which stood on a dais at one end of the great hall in which Count Nilden had led them. The throne room was vast, with a high vaulted ceiling and walls covered with what seemed acres of heavy red velvet drapery. There were candles everywhere, and dozens of people strolled about in fine clothes and chatted idly in the corners, all but ignoring the presence of the king. "May I announce you?" Count Nilden asked Mr. Wolf. "Fulrach knows who I am," Wolf replied shortly, and strode down the long scarlet carpet towards the throne with Aunt Paul still on his arm. Garion and the others followed. With Brendig and his soldiers close behind, though the suddenly quiet crowd of couriers and their ladies. At the foot of the throne, they all stopped, and Wolf bowed rather coldly. Aunt Paul, her eyes frosty, curtsied, and Beric and Silk bowed in a courtly manner. Dernick and Garion followed suit, though not nearly as gracefully. "If it please your majesty," Brendig's voice came from behind them, "these are the ones you sought." "I knew you could be depended upon, Lord Brendig," the king replied in a rather ordinary-sounding voice. "Your reputation is well deserved. You have my thanks." Then he looked at Mr. Wolf and the rest of them, his expression undecipherable. Garion began to tremble. "My dear old friend," the king said to Mr. Wolf, "it's been too many years since we last met." "Have you lost your wits entirely, Fulrach?" Mr. Wolf snapped in a voice which carried no further than the king's ears. "Why do you choose to interfere with me now of all times, and what possessed you to outfit me in this absurd thing?" He plucked at the front of the white robe in disgust. "Are you trying to announce my presence to every mergirl from here to the Hook of Arendia?" The king's face looked pained. "I was afraid you might take it this way," he said in a voice no louder than Mr. Wolf's had been. "I'll explain when we can speak more privately." He turned quickly to Aunt Paul, as if trying to preserve the appearance, at least, of dignity. "It's been much too long since we have seen you, dear lady. Layla and the children have missed you, and I have been desolate in your absence." "Your Majesty is too kind," Aunt Paul said, her tone as cold as Wolf's. The king winced. "Pray, dear lady," he apologized, "don't judge me too hastily. My reasons were urgent. I hope that Lord Brendig's summons did not too greatly inconvenience you. Lord Brendig was the soul of courtesy, Aunt Paul said, her tone unchanged. She glanced once at Brendig, who had grown visibly pale. And you, my Lord Beric, the king hurried on as if trying to make the best of the bad situation. How fares your cousin, our dear brother, King Anheg of Cherrick? He was well when I last saw him, your majesty, Beric replied formally. A bit drunk, but that's not unusual for Anheg. The king chuckled a bit nervously and turned quickly to Silk. Prince Keldar of the royal house of Drasnia, he said. We are amazed to find such noble visitors in our realm, and more than a little injured that they chose not to call upon us so that we might greet them. Is the king of the Sendars of so little note that he's not even worth a brief stop? We intended no disrespect, your majesty, Silk replied, bowing, but our errand was of such urgency that there was no time for the usual courtesies. The king flickered a warning glance at that and surprisingly wove his fingers in the scarce perceptible gestures of the Drasnian secret language, not here too many ears about. He then looked inquiringly at Dernick and Garion. Aunt Paul stepped forward. This is Goodman Dernick of the district of Arat, your majesty, she said. A brave and honest man. Welcome, Goodman Dernick, the king said. Can only hope that men may also one day call me a brave and honest man. Dernick bowed awkwardly, his face filled with bewilderment. I'm just a simple blacksmith, your honor, he said, but I hope all men know that I am your honor's most loyal and devoted subject. Well spoken, good man, Dernick, the king said with a smile, and then he looked at Garion. Aunt Paul followed his gaze. A boy, your majesty, she said rather indifferently, Garion by name. He was placed in my care some years ago, and accompanies us because I didn't know what else to do with him. A terrible coldness struck at Garion's stomach. The certainty that her casual words were in fact the bald truth came crashing down upon him. She had not even tried to soften the blow. The indifference with which she had destroyed his life hurt almost more than the destruction itself. Also welcome, Garion, the king said. You travel in noble company for one so young. I didn't know who they were, your majesty, Garion said miserably. No one tells me anything. The king laughed in tolerant amusement. As you grow older, Garion, he said, you'll probably find that during these days such innocence is the most comfortable state in which to live. I've been told things of late that I'd much prefer not to know. May we speak privately now, Furlick, Mr. Wolf said, his voice still irritated. In good time, my old friend, the king replied. I've ordered a banquet prepared in your honor. Let's all go in and dine. Layla and the children are waiting for us. There will be time later to discuss certain matters. And with that, he rose and stepped down from his dais. Garion sunk in his private misery, fell in beside Silk. Prince Keldar, he said, desperately needing to take his mind off the shocking reality that had just fallen upon him. An accident of birth, Garion, Silk said with a shrug. Something over which I have no control. Fortunately, I'm only the nephew of the King of Drasnia, and far down in the line of succession. I'm not in any immediate danger of ascending the throne, and Beric is the cousin of King Eneg of Cherrick, Silk replied. He looked over his shoulder. What is your exact rank, Beric? He asked. The Earl of Trelham, Beric rumbled. Why do you ask? The lad here was curious, Silk said. It's all nonsense anyway, Beric said. But when Enheg becomes king, someone has to become clan chief. In Cherrick, you can't be both. It's considered unlucky, particularly by the chiefs of the other clans. I can see why they might feel that way, Silk laughed. It's an empty title anyway, Beric observed. There hasn't been a clan war in Cherrick for over 3,000 years. I let my youngest brother act in my stead. He's a simple-minded fellow and easily amused. Besides, it annoys my wife. You're married? Garion was startled. If you want to call it that, Beric said sourly. Silk nudged Garion warningly, indicating that this was a delicate subject. Why didn't you tell us? Garion demanded accusingly. About your titles, I mean. Would it make any difference? Silk asked. Well, no, Garion admitted, but he stopped, unable to put his feelings about the matter into words. I don't understand any of this, he concluded lamely. It'll all become clear in time, Silk assured him as they entered the banquet hall. The hall was almost as large as the throne room. There were long tables covered with fine linen cloth, and once again candles everywhere. A servant stood behind each chair, and everything was supervised by a plump little woman with a beaming face, and a tiny crown perched precariously atop her head. As they all entered, she came forward quickly. Dear Paul, she said, you looked just wonderful. She embraced Aunt Paul warmly, and the two began talking together animatedly. Queen Layla, Silk explained briefly to Garion. They call her the mother of Sendaria. The 4 children over there are hers. She has 4 or 5 others, older and probably away on state business. Since Fulrach insists that his children earn their keep, it's a standard joke among the other kings that Queen Layla's been pregnant since she was 14. But that's probably because they're expected to send royal gifts at each new birth. She's a good woman, though, and she keeps King Fulrach from making too many mistakes. She knows Aunt Paul, Garion said, and that fact disturbed him for some reason. Everyone knows your Aunt Paul, Silk told him. Since Aunt Paul and the Queen were deep in conversation and already drifting toward the head of the table, Garion stayed close to Dernick. Don't let me make any mistakes, he gestured, trying to keep the movements of his fingers inconspicuous. Silk winked in reply. Once they were all seated and the food began to arrive, Garion began to relax. He found that all he had to do was follow Silk's lead, and the intricate niceties of formal dining no longer intimidated him. The talk about him was dignified and quite incomprehensible, but he reasoned that no one was likely to pay much attention to him and that he was probably safe if he kept his mouth shut and his eyes on his plate. An elderly noblewoman with a beautifully curly... an elderly nobleman with a beautifully curled silvery beard, however, leaned toward him. You have traveled recently, I'm told, he said in a somewhat condescending tone. How fares the kingdom, young man? Garion looked helplessly across the table at Silk. What do I say? He gestured with his fingers. Tell him that the kingdom fares no better nor worse than might be anticipated under the present circumstances, Silk replied. Garion dutifully repeated that. Ah, the old nobleman said. Much as I had expected. You're a very observant boy for one so young. I enjoy talking with young people. Their views are so fresh. Who is he? Garion gestured. The Earl of Selene, Silk replied. He's a tiresome old bore, but be polite to him. Address him as my lord. And how did you find the roads? The Earl inquired. Somewhat in disrepair, my lord, Garion replied with Silk's prompting. But that's normal for this time of year, isn't it? Indeed it is, the Earl said approvingly. What a splendid boy you are. The strange three-way conversation continued, and Garion even began to enjoy himself as the comments fed to him by Silk seemed to amaze the old gentleman. At last, the banquet was over, and the king rose from his seat at the head of the table. And now, dear friends, he announced, Queen Layla and I would like to visit privately with our noble guests, and so we pray you will excuse us. He offered his arm to Aunt Paul. Mr. Wolf offered his to the plump little queen, and the 4 of them walked toward the far door of the hall. The Earl of Selene smiled broadly at Garion and then looked across the table. I've enjoyed our conversation, Prince Keldar, he said to Silk. I may indeed be a tiresome old bore, as you say, but that can sometimes be an advantage, don't you think? Silk laughed ruefully. I should have known that an old fox like you would be an adept at the secret language, my lord. A legacy from my misspent youth, the Earl laughed. Your pupil is most proficient, Prince Keldar, but his accent is strange. The weather was cold while he was learning, my lord, Silk said, and our fingers were a bit stiff. I'll correct the problem when we have leisure. The old nobleman seemed enormously pleased with himself at having outsmarted Silk. Splendid boy, he said, patting Garion's shoulder, and then he went off, chuckling to himself. You knew he understood all along, Garion accused Silk. Of course, Silk said. Dresnian intelligence knows every adept at our secret speech, sometimes it's useful to permit certain carefully selected messages to be intercepted. Don't ever underestimate the Earl of Selene, however. It's not impossible that he's at least as clever as I am, but look how much he enjoyed catching us. Can't you ever do anything without being sly? Garion asked. His tone was a bit grumpy since he was convinced that somehow he had been the butt of the whole joke. Not unless I absolutely have to, my Garion, Silk laughed. People such as I continually practice deception, even when it's not necessary. Our lives sometimes depend on how cunning we are, and so we need to keep our wits sharp. It must be a lonely way to live, Garion observed, rather shrewdly at the silent prompting of his inner voice. You never really trust anyone, do you? I suppose not, Silk said. It's a game we play, Garion. We're all very skilled at it. At least we are if we intend to live very long. We all know each other since we're members of a very small profession. The rewards are great, but after a while we play our game only for the joy of defeating each other. You're right, though. It is lonely, and sometimes disgusting. But most of the time, it's a great deal of fun. Count Nilden came up to them and bowed politely. His Majesty asks that you and the boy join him and the other friends in his private apartments, Prince Keldar, he said. If you'll be so good as to follow me. Of course, Silk said. Come along, Garion. The king's private apartments were much simpler than the ornate halls in the main palace. King Fulrach had removed his crown and state robes and now looked much like any other Sendar in rather ordinary clothes. He stood talking quietly with Berg. Queen Layla and Aunt Paul were seated on a couch deep in conversation, and Dernick was not far away, trying his best to look inconspicuous. Mr. Wolf stood alone near a window, his face like a thundercloud. Ah, Prince Keldar, the king said. We thought perhaps you and Garion had been waylaid. We were fencing with the Earl of Selene, your majesty, Silk said lightly. Figuratively speaking, of course. Be careful of him, the king cautioned. It's quite possible that he's too shrewd even for one of your talents. I have a great deal of respect for the old scoundrel, Silk laughed. King Fulrach glanced apprehensively at Mr. Wolf, then squared his shoulders and sighed. I suppose we'd better get this unpleasantness over with, he said. Layla, would you entertain our other guests while I give our grim-faced old friend there and the lady the opportunity to scold me? It's obvious that he's not going to be happy until they've said a few unkind things to me about some matters that weren't really my fault. Of course, dear, Queen Layla said. Try not to be too long, and please don't shout. The children have been put to bed, and they need their rest. Aunt Paul rose from the couch, and she and Mr. Wolf, whose expression hadn't changed, followed the king into an adjoining chamber. Well then, Queen Layla said pleasantly, what shall we talk about? I am instructed, your highness, to convey the regards of Queen Poren of Drasnia to you should the occasion arise, Silk said in a courtly manner. She asks leave of you to broach a correspondence on a matter of some delicacy. Why, of course, Queen Layla beamed. She's a dear child, far too pretty and sweet-natured for that fat old bandit Rodar. I hope he hasn't made her unhappy. No, your highness, Silk said. Amusing though it may seem, she loves my uncle to distraction, and he, of course, is delirious with joy over so young and beautiful a wife. It's positively sickening the way they dote on each other. Someday, Prince Keldar, you will fall in love, the queen said with a little smirk, and the 12 kingdoms will stand around and chortle over the fall of so notorious a bachelor. What is this matter Poren wishes to discuss with me? It's a question of fertility, your highness, Silk said with a delicate cough. She wants to present my uncle with an heir, and she needs to seek your advice in the business. The entire world stands in awe of your gifts in that particular area. Queen Layla blushed prettily and then laughed. I'll write to her a note, she promised. Garion by now had carefully worked his way to the door through which King Fulrach had taken Aunt Paul and Mr. Wolf. He began a meticulous examination of the tapestry on the wall to conceal the fact that he was trying to hear what was going on behind the closed door. It took him only a moment to begin to pick up familiar voices. Exactly what does all this foolishness mean, Fulrach? Mr. Wolf was saying. Please don't judge me too hastily, Ancient One, the king said placatingly. Some things have happened that you might not be aware of. You know that I'm aware of everything that happens, Wolf said. Did you know that we are defenseless if the accursed one awakens? That which held him in check has been stolen from off the throne of the Riven King. As a matter of fact, I was following the trail of the thief when your noble captain Brendig interrupted me in my search. I'm sorry, Fulrach said, but you wouldn't have gone much further anyway. All the kings of Eloria have been searching for you for 3 months now. Your likeness, drawn by the finest artists in the hands of every ambassador, agent, and official of the 5 kingdoms of the north. Actually, you've been followed since you left Doreen. Fulrach, I'm busy. Tell the Alorn kings to leave me alone. Why are they suddenly so interested in my movements? They want to have counsel with you, the king said. The Alorns are preparing for war, and even my poor Sendaria is being quietly mobilized. If the accursed one arises now, we're all doomed. The power that has been stolen can very possibly be used to awaken him, and his first move will be to attack the west. You know that, Belgarath. And you also know that until the return of the Riven King, the west has no real defense. Garion blinked and started violently, then tried to cover the sudden movement by bending to look at some of the finer details on the tapestry. He told himself that he heard wrong. The name King Fulrach had spoken could not have really have been Belgarath. Belgarath was a fairy tale figure, a myth. Just tell the Alorn kings that I'm in pursuit of the thief, Mr. Wolf said. I don't have time for counsels just now. If they'll leave me alone, I should be able to catch up with him before he can do any mischief with the things he's managed to steal. Don't tempt fate, Fulrach, Aunt Paul advised. Your interference is costing us time, and we can't afford to lose. Presently, I'll become vexed with you. The king's voice was firm as he answered. I know your power, Lady Polgara, he said, and Garion jumped again. I don't have any choice, however, the king continued. I'm bound by my word to deliver you up at Val Alorn to the kings of Eloria, and a king can't break his word to other kings. There was a long silence in the other room, while Garion's mind raced through a dozen possibilities. You're not a bad man, Fulrach, Mr. Wolf said. Not perhaps as bright as I might wish, but a good man nonetheless. I won't raise my hand against you, nor will my daughter. Speak for yourself, old wolf, Aunt Paul said grimly. No, Polgara, he said. If we have to go to Val Alorn, let's go with all possible speed. The sooner we explain things to the Alorns, the sooner they'll stop interfering. I think age is beginning to soften your brain, Father, Aunt Paul said. We don't have the time for this excursion to Val Alorn. Fulrach can explain to the Alorn kings. It won't do any good, Lady Polgara, the king said rather ruefully. As your father so pointedly mentioned, I'm not considered very bright. The Alorn kings won't listen to me. If you leave now, they'll just send someone like Brendig to apprehend you again. Then that unfortunate man may suddenly find himself living out the remainder of his days as a toad or possibly a radish, Aunt Paul said ominously. Enough of that, Paul, Mr. Wolf said. Is there a ship ready, Fulrach? It lies at the north wharf. It lies at the north wharf, Belgarath, the king replied. A chariot vessel sent by King Enheg. Very well, Mr. Wolf said. Tomorrow, then, we'll go to Cherik. It seems that I'm going to have to point out a few things to some thick-headed Alorns. Will you be going with us? I'm obliged to, Fulrach said. The council's to be general, and Sendaria's involved. You haven't heard the last of this, Fulrach, Aunt Paul said. Never mind, Paul, Mr. Wolf said. He's only doing what he thinks is right. We'll straighten it all out in Val Alorn. Garion was trembling as he stepped away from the door. It was impossible. The skeptical Sendarian upbringing made him, at first, incapable of even comprehending such an absurdity. Reluctantly, however, he finally forced himself to look the idea full in the face. What if Mr. Wolf really was Belgarath the sorcerer, A man who lived for over 7,000 years. And what if Aunt Paul was really his daughter, Polgara the sorceress, who was only slightly younger? All the bits and pieces, the cryptic hints, the half-truths fell together. Silk had been right. She could not be his aunt. Garion's orphaning was complete now. He was adrift in the world with no ties of blood or heritage to cling to. Desperately, he wanted to go home, back to Falder's farm, where he could sink himself in unthinking obscurity in a quiet place, where there were no sorcerers or strange searches or anything that would even remind him of Aunt Paul and the cruel hoax that she had made of his life. And so ends part 1 of Sendaria. When we continue next time, we will begin with part 2, Cherik.